So firstly, an introduction that Laura and myself both cover a range of business and industrial energy efficiency schemes within BEIS, the Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy in the UK. I come at it from the policy perspective and Laura comes at it from the analytical perspective. So we're keen to, I guess, cover both sides, both in terms of what we are looking to get out of ESOS, but also what it's delivered so far and what it might deliver in future. So my screen has gone.
We see the content slide now, Gary.
Implemented in the UK. The evaluation work we commissioned, the findings from our evaluation, and what next for policies to expand business and energy efficiency. So my presentation is not showing the slides, so I'll see what I can do. So why are we interested in business and industry? Well, if you look at the UK emissions, business and industry in terms of buildings and processes are responsible for 25% of UK emissions. And given some of the challenges that we have, and I'm going to say something about a bit later, then it's particularly important to look at the impact that will have across the economy and how we might save things. So ESOS fits in that context. So what is ESOS? So ESOS is an energy audit scheme with the acronym has been used for quite a while that people don't necessarily always remember. The acronym stands for Energy Savings Opportunity Scheme, because I think we were keen both to set out what organisations had by way of energy use across buildings, transport and processes, and the opportunities that came out of it. And our requirements are effectively based on Article 8.4 of the Energy Efficiency Directive, that there needs to be an audit by all large undertakings at least once every 4 years through an assessor conducting an audit of energy use across the business and making recommendations for energy efficiency improvements, or as we would say, opportunities. It was introduced in 2014, so a year after the requirement came forward through the directive, and the first compliance year ended in December 2015. And as I say, ESOS is valuable, that it's one of the schemes that looks across different end use sectors. So it covers buildings, industrial processes and transport. And when we introduced it, and what the evaluation was looking at was how had it delivered against the objectives that were set for it in 2014. And I think we recognise things have changed a bit since 2014, but what we were keen to understand was, did it give large businesses or undertakings information that was specific enough to them to enable them to make energy savings? Did it stimulate action in terms of take-up of cost-effective energy efficiency measures? We're also conscious we are Department for Business, So we wanted to ensure that the cost for businesses of complying with the directive were minimised to be as little as possible. But we also wanted to maximise the synergy to existing policies. And I think we recognise that there are a lot of policies out there that cover different elements of this. So I think we were keen to understand what the impact had been. I'll now move across to Laura, who hopefully can pick up the baton to talk about the evaluation approach and the methods. And then I'll come back afterwards to talk about how we're taking forward the outcome and the evaluation. So hopefully you managed to see most of that.
We certainly did, Gary. So I think in the end, it started to work out smoothly.
Hello, everyone. It's Laura here, and I'm an evaluator in BEIS. And I hope you can see my screen.
Not yet.
Oh, we'll give it a moment.
Mm-hmm. We are seeing your screen, but it's a black screen that we are seeing.
Oh dear. Let me try again.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so I will say next slide. So if you go on to the next slide. So we actually had two evaluations of ESOS. We had an interim evaluation that started in the first compliance year. And this included a baseline survey of those in scope of ESOS, and also a feasibility study, which was looking at the possibility for doing a future impact evaluation. And then the impact evaluation included a follow-up survey, so taking 2 years on from the baseline, the original baseline survey, and it sat within a much wider piece looking at the impact and the effectiveness of energy audits and energy reporting more generally. And both evaluations were conducted by Ipsos Mori Limited and University College London. Okay, next screen. So this slide shows our research questions for the second evaluation. This is what we call our impact evaluation, though it's not a typical impact evaluation. We had an overarching question that explored the use of energy audits and reporting in the round. And this was really to see how effective these are in general at driving energy efficiency. Then for ESOS, we had two evaluation questions on the influence and impact of ESOS, and another one on the lessons for future policy. Next screen. So there were several evaluation challenges identified during the feasibility study in our first evaluation. The first of these is really around the universality of ESOS, in that it applies to all large businesses. And therefore we had to think about whether a counterfactual could be established. The second of these, it was around the policy landscape. It's very complex, lots of overlapping policies, so multiple policies affecting large businesses. And so the question for the evaluation there was, how could we establish the additionality of the scheme? Then we had two challenges which were unique to the scheme, which were around the collection of data for the evaluation. The first of these reflects the fact that ESOS participants, the way the scheme was set up, they were not required to submit the content of their energy assessments to the scheme administrator. Therefore, the evaluation had to be able to collect data on the recommendations and any measures installed as a result of ESOS. And the final challenge for us there, the key one, was around the fact that organisations could comply either at the ultimate parent group level or for individual subsidiary companies. And although the majority of firms complied at the ultimate parent group level, there were responses for subsidiary organisations, and the challenge for the evaluation was to understand how findings could be generalised across the wider non-domestic sector. And the data we had available was mainly at parent level. Next. So we used a theory of change and a realist-inspired approach to help answer the evaluation questions. For the realist approach, we adopted a context mechanism outcome framework, a CMO framework, which informed the data collection during the evaluation and also the analysis that we undertook. And the main data collection and analytical methods were a survey of ESOS organisations, which fed into the energy and emission savings modelling. And this was at parent level, reflecting the compliance data that we had. And there was also qualitative research with ESOS organisations and supply chain firms and ESOS assessors. And this included subsidiaries so that we could understand how energy savings recommendations have been shared across companies. Okay, next slide. So in the end, there were two main pieces of data collection and analysis that supported our understanding of the impacts of the scheme. There was a survey of ESOS organisations, and this allowed the evaluation to look at the measures installed and the wider context for those organisations. And this survey data was used alongside other data, for example, floor area or mileage data, to model the energy and fuel efficiency savings that we could attribute to ESOS organisations. And this, as part of the modelling work, was scaled up to the whole ESOS population. Now, at the bottom of this chart, there's an additional piece of analysis which was conducted to look at firm level characteristics such as capital investment and energy and fuel expenditure, but also energy consumption over time. However, this was not included in the final evaluation report because of limitations, for example, for matching different data sets together, or it not being possible to robustly attribute any changes to ESOS without a control group. Next. And to understand the extent that we could attribute impact to ESOS, the evaluation included case studies and qualitative research which explored the influence of ESOS and how this compared to other drivers of energy efficiency behaviour. And we use these three main groups to triangulate the evidence. So we looked at ESOS complier organisations, organisations who were not within the scope of ESOS, for example, smaller businesses, and also those who had conducted ESOS assessments, so those who'd actually undertaken these in the field, so ESOS assessors, but also organisations in the wider supply chain. And this evidence allowed us to test the hypotheses in our context mechanism outcome framework, and they allowed a much deeper exploration of the context which sat behind organisational responses to the policy. Next. Okay, I'm not going to talk in great detail about this, partly because it's very difficult to see it. It's a very large theory of change with very small writing. So apologies for that, but you can always look at our report, which we'll have links to later. But our theory of change set out the causal pathway through which the inputs and activities involved in ESOS were anticipated to lead to the intended outcomes and impacts. And we use this really to understand how, which groups we needed to be speaking to as part of the evaluation, and what types of questions we should be asking. And also it informed how we analysed the data from the survey and from other pieces of data we collected. So on to the key findings. I'm going to give you a little flavour of what we found in the evaluation. So ESOS was really one of the factors driving energy efficiency, although not the most the major factor or any of the major factors affecting it. But what we did find was that we asked participants to the survey in 2016 and again in 2018 about all the types of energy efficiency actions they implemented or planned since 2015. And that coincided with the first compliance year. Then we asked about the extent that they attributed these to ESOS. And in 2018, 38% attributed at least one measure in part to ESOS, and 6% said it was a direct result of ESOS. And as you can see there, process and lighting measures were the most commonly attributed to the policy. Next. Similarly, ESOS had a small but significant contribution to the implementation of transport measures. So again, these questions were asked about ESOS organisations who had fleets, and there were around a third who attributed fuel efficiency measures in part to ESOS, and 4% who said it was a direct result of the policy. And more generally, the proportion of low carbon vehicles we saw increase between 2016 and 2018. So on this slide, I'm going to talk a little bit about the outputs that came out of the modelling of the energy efficiency savings. And we use the survey results and the other data I mentioned to model energy and fuel efficiency savings from the first phase of ESOS. If you click again, there are some uncertainties associated with the modelling. So we concentrate on the central estimate from this modelling. And this is, if you click again, broadly comparable to the predictions we made before ESOS was implemented. So between 0.5 and 1.5 terawatt hours approximately of energy saved across the scheme. Okay, so there were a range of benefits that the evaluation attributes to ESOS. 37% of survey organisations said that they had made net cost savings as a result of ESOS. And the types of mechanisms producing these savings, if you click again. So it really achieved these through highlighting new saving opportunities and through external validation of known opportunities. So, and there are other changes that were prompted by ESOS, including behavioural changes, for example, implementing plans for goals, energy efficiency related goals, action plans and staff training. And that was roughly around 20% of organisations reported this. Plus around 7% of organisations said that ESOS had prompted their certification to ISO 50001, and a quarter reported that the level of priority placed on energy efficiency at board level had increased due to ESOS. And there were also reputational or productivity benefits reported by the organisations in the study. 16% said that it had improved their reputation. Next. And 8% of organisations reported that ESOS had improved indoor conditions for staff, customers or clients. Next. And ESOS also contributed to the improvement of awareness and the discussion around energy. And in addition to those quotes that I've got on the screen, 29% of organisations shared their audit report within their corporate group. And the evaluation also explored the context behind the adoption of ESOS recommendations. Organisations who'd been prompted by ESOS to become certified to ISO 50001 or to adopt energy plans or goals, where they hadn't already used these, were more likely to implement their ESOS recommendations. However, if they were already energy mature before ESOS, so they already had plans or certification before ESOS was introduced, then this didn't prompt them to implement additional measures. So for this energy mature group, there was less scope for ESOS to capture unrealised energy potential, although organisations sometimes use their ESOS audits to confirm the measures that they had wanted to implement anyway. So this research suggested that there are other factors that are more important drivers of organisational decisions and action than energy audits and the ESOS audits. The first three of these, financial drivers, natural equipment lifespan, and so the first two of these are barriers that you'd expect to see. Organisations reporting, and then, sorry, apologies, I've got these the wrong way around. And then, so you'd expect to see financial drivers and competing priorities as sort of a barrier to businesses implementing energy efficiency measures. However, there are also sort of clear milestones where businesses can be influenced to improve their energy efficiency around the end of equipment lifespan or relocation. And finally, an organisation's corporate social responsibility agenda might be influenced by key decision makers or a parent company. And we had examples of overseas parent companies pushing for lower energy consumption or emissions. And there also is the desire in the same area to score highly on measures, for example, like the Dow Jones Sustainability Index or similar benchmarking opportunities. And so on to my final slide. Okay, so this slide is about how ESOS affected the market for energy assessors. ESOS led to a short-term spike in energy audits rather than a sustained demand between compliance phases. So in the short term, there was a lot of work for over 900 ESOS assessors, and many assessors were already engaged in energy or auditing services. However, there were some new entrants, and we also saw an expansion of the experience of assessors into auditing transport. And the demand for ESOS assessors peaked in late 2015, so very much close to the compliance deadline. But in the longer term, we've seen less of an impact of ESOS on the assessor market than we originally expected. So about a quarter of organisations commissioned further follow-on work, particularly around undertaking more detailed, comprehensive investment grade audits, or the implementation of actual energy efficiency measures. And the reasons why ESOS assessors said that they didn't necessarily complete this type of follow-on work is that they had their own lack of capacity or time to deliver these additional services, or because they'd only been motivated really by the short-term revenue boost and didn't need a longer-term client relationship. So I hope that has given you a flavour of our findings. Is it possible now to hand over back to Gary to discuss what happened next with what's happening next for us and perhaps with you in policy development?
Hopefully you can hear me.
Yes, Gary, hear you loud and clear. Go ahead, and I'll change the slides for you.
Okay. So I guess having the kind of valuable information from the evaluation, it helps us and thinks about how does ESOS fit within the wider business energy efficiency landscape and the work that BEIS and UK government are doing to drive it forward. Next slide, please. And I guess the key strategic document that we would use to look at this is a document called the Clean Growth Strategy that was published in 2017 that sets out how across the economy government was going to meet our legal challenges to significantly decarbonise by 2050. And the work that we need to do on business energy efficiency is set in that context. So in the Clean Growth Strategy, we set out that by 2030, businesses would need to improve their energy efficiency by at least 20%. And that was against a 2015 baseline. And you can look at that in different ways, whether that's in terms of absolute energy use or energy intensity. But whatever way you look at it, there are still challenges in doing that. But it's also worth looking at the benefits that that would deliver in terms of energy costs for businesses would be reduced by an estimated annual £6 billion compared to what they would otherwise be in 2030. You were delivering carbon savings of 22 megatons of carbon dioxide equivalent in 2030. And I think when we set out that document, that was on the basis of the clean growth targets and decarbonisation targets we had at the time. But you may be aware that last year, the government moved beyond the clean growth strategy 80% by 2050 carbon reduction, emissions reduction, to delivering net zero by 2050 to reflect some of the changes that were made in the level of emissions reduction that was required to limit the impacts of climate change going forward. Next page, please. But I think we also, in looking at what government should do, want to understand better the various barriers, as well as how we can simulate demand for energy efficiency. And this slide, hopefully, people will have seen similar slides that set out the range of barriers that inhibit businesses. Also recognizing that businesses, and I'll show some other slides later, aren't a one size fits all. So you need to look at both at the individual barriers, but also the barriers in how they will impact in combination. So whether it's business sales of energy efficiency being low, whether it's the market for energy efficiency products and services not being quite as established as some of the markets, or whether it's some of the payback of energy efficiency measures, they're all quite different for different parts of industry, and also recognizing that often policies are looked at a household or domestic level and a non-domestic level. And there are also some businesses that span the two. So often a micro business is more akin to a household than it is to a large business. Next slide, please. And as I said there, we also need to look at where is the energy use most prevalent. And in the UK, there's obviously a balance between services and manufacturing, but also the different fuels that are used both currently and will be used forward, particularly when you talk about some of the changes that are being thought about for heating and transport which will also require additional energy, and also how they look across the different buildings, industrial processes. And this doesn't include energy on transport as well. And ESOS has, I guess, has the benefit of covering all of those different sectors and allowing companies to understand how much of their energy use goes across buildings, transport and processes, and also allows businesses to factor on those areas where the payback for energy efficiency might be most important. Next slide, please. So I guess in looking at what we've seen from the evidence, I guess of the evaluation, there are two things to recognise. One is that actually the directive and the regulations for ESOS are very much focused on the what rather than the how. So they aren't necessarily that prescriptive on what the requirements are, what is a good audit, what is a minimum standards audit. So there are some challenges there even in looking at the quality of audits that we've had, both through the first phase of ESOS and the more recent phase that closed in 2019. Not all audits passed first time, and I think certainly from phase one, there were already 80% of audits that would either, in driving test parlance, have a minor fault or a serious fault. So there is an element of looking at getting all audits up to a minimum standard, but also recognising in some way that there is also an option for businesses when they are acquiring the audit services to take a call on how much do they need to spend, which will often be look at A, the complexity of their energy use, and B, how it's balanced across different sectors. But I think we have done things to do that and strengthen it through the first phases. So for example, in a more recent phase, we put out a checklist that said, this is the minimum requirement that an audit will need to meet the regulations. And we also put out but this is what a very good audit might look like. So gave choices in terms of that. And also recognising, as Laura said, that some organisations, and for phase one, it was roughly 5 to 10% of audits were using ISO 50001 as their compliance route, rather than a straight, somewhat more simple audit, which also had the benefit of requiring continuous annual improvement rather than just being focused on having a full yearly cycle. And I think we do recognise that a number of organisations will continue to see this as a compliance obligation rather than an opportunity. So we'll just do the minimum to meet the requirement that they have a audit that meets the minimum requirement. So this slide sets out some of the things that we think about might be looked at for going beyond the kind of current formulation of ESOS and might be looked at for the 2022-23 phase. So one of the things is, should we mandate implementation of recommendations? So should you require organisations to mandate the recommendations, particularly those that are of a lower payback? Do we extend the scope of ESOS to go beyond the large undertakings that it currently covers? Because we recognise that actually there are less than 20,000 large undertakings in the UK, and that compares to 5.7 million businesses. Not all of them use huge amounts of energy, but is there some scope for doing something in that to cover the vast majority of businesses that aren't covered by ESOS? And we're also looking at other approaches, such as a separate small business energy efficiency scheme. Do we look at a way to encourage compliance via ISO 50001, which aligns energy management with other parts of the business and brings in quality systems that can continue on an annual basis? And do we do something in terms of public disclosure? aligning with a new streamlined energy and carbon reporting that all large or quoted businesses from 2019 are required to include in their annual reports, their company annual reports, alongside their financial information. So that should say what energy have they used across buildings, transport and processes, and what are the emissions aligning from that, and also what energy efficiency actions have they taken in the last year. So again, could the fact that you need to disclose what is required stimulate more action than is currently being driven by ESOS? Next slide, please. But I think there is also an element of making those changes isn't quite as simple as might be thought about. And these are some of the challenges that you need to, I guess, reflect if you are going to design elements to strengthen ESOS. For example, how could some of these issues be gamed by, for example, always coming in with quite low estimates for payback so that they don't necessarily go above any thresholds that might be set? How do you encourage behaviour change, which often doesn't have a payback attached to it, but is something that needs to reinforce, because it shouldn't just be about implementing measures on their own? And how does that tie to some of the work that we're also doing, looking at the kind of in-use performance of buildings? How does ESOS tie in with, or any strengthening tie in with maintenance cycles? And also in terms of, again, we are the Department for Business. So if we are adding to business requirements for them to implement measures, how might they pay or find the finance to pay for those, to implement those measures? And I guess particularly at current times where companies are rightly focusing on just keeping afloat, rather than looking necessarily as long term as we might like them to. Next slide, please. So I guess we're happy to go on to questions now, but firstly, a thank you for the opportunity to set out what we've done by way of evaluation of ESOS and the ways that we're thinking forward. These are the links for the reports that Laura's talked about. We've also published a post-implementation review that can be found on that link that sets out some of the thoughts on strengthening ESOS. And there's our emails as well if you want to contact us after the session. So thank you.